So my name is Tim Kautz. I'm currently a researcher at Mathematica Policy Research. Before that, I worked at the Center for the Economics of Human Development at the University of Chicago and was a graduate student there in the economics department. So for the past 6 years or so, my research has really focused on this idea of non-cognitive skills. And by that I mean the set of skills that are not adequately captured by IQ tests or achievement tests. And the focus on these skills has been understanding the extent to which these kinds of skills matter for success in life and help determine that success in people, and also how they can be developed through education and through other types of social programs and interventions. When I went to college, I actually thought I was going to be a fiction writer, and math was the last thing that I thought I would end up being part of my major. Yet 7 years later, I ended up in the University of Chicago in the economics department. I had a formative experience in college where I took an economics class, Intro to Economics, just because I thought it was something I should try. And then that summer, I spent a summer in Tanzania where I taught about HIV and AIDS education in schools in Tanzania. And part of the problem at the time with HIV was that very few people in Africa were getting tested. And a kid in one of my classes asked this really insightful question, which is, what is the point of getting tested if the treatment is really, really expensive? And I thought about that and I said, that's a really good question. And what dawned on me was two things. One, this kid had a great insight. And two, is that the kinds of lessons I learned in economics applied to social issues, and it was actually a very good lens for studying social issues. And then I returned back to college and took a class on health economics and really enjoyed the field and better understood how I could apply the tools of economics to specifically health issues at the time. But I was more generally interested in inequality and human capital development. And so from there, I started taking more and more economics classes and got to know the teacher of that health economics class, who played a huge role in my development, and ended up doing research with him about HIV, and exactly in my honors thesis studied that question that the kid raised in my class, which is basically the relationship between the price of treatment for HIV and the testing rates in different countries. So I showed that the testing rate was really sensitive to the price of treatment, which made a lot of sense, but not something that people had studied in the past. And the takeaway was that there was this other benefit for providing treatment, which is it meant that more people in general got tested, and that's something people hadn't accounted for previously. So I continued taking more math and more economics, and my mentor at the time suggested that I go to graduate school, and that's what I ended up doing. And so I ended up at the University of Chicago, but in the back of my mind, there's still this real interest in social issues and how to use tools like economics to basically try to improve the world and reduce inequality. And then I took a class with Jim Heckman, who eventually became my advisor at the University of Chicago. And the class didn't focus on health, which is what I originally came to study, but focused on education. And in particular, how we could think about using education as a way to reduce inequality by teaching a broad set of skills to children. And the basic argument was that this set of skills would enable them to succeed in life and would provide them with a certain kind of self-reliance and a certain kind of investment that would last their entire lifetime. And I thought this was a really compelling argument, and sort of like with what I observed when I was in Africa, it was a way to apply these kinds of tools to a real practical problem in the world. And so I became very interested in skill development, and in particular, this concept of non-cognitive skills, the set of skills that has been sort of overlooked in the last 20 years in our education system, and how to both think about measuring those skills, but also, more importantly, think about how to develop them in children or even adolescents and adults. And so I've really continued with that focus, and I think one thing that differentiates, I don't want to say just myself and how we've approached this problem, but the center that I worked for during graduate school is really viewing this as an economic problem related to investment. And I think there's a lot of other fields that have studied development of skills, but this approach differed in two main ways. One is that people tended to just focus on a very particular time in the life cycle. So people would be an expert in primary school education and developing skills there. People would be an expert in high school or pre-K or whatever. And I think that has real benefits because they really understand that area. But what this approach did is it combined all of those areas together and viewed it as an investment over someone's lifetime, and studied how not only can you build skills in a particular time period, but how that development of a skill can carry over to future time periods. So just as a concrete example, if you can increase how persistent children are at a young age, that affects how they learn throughout elementary school, middle school, high school, because then they're able to acquire knowledge at higher rates. So that skill, and the terms that we use in some papers, begets further skills. And then the second way I think this approach differed is thinking how to quantify the benefits of a program that would develop those kinds of skills. And so a main benefit of this approach is we could then say that the rate of return to a particular program, place everything in terms of a rate of return. And that's a really useful metric because it speaks to policymakers who are considering a budget and how to invest in different types of programs. And if they see that there's one that has a particularly high rate of return, they know that's a good place to put resources. So I think those are two ways in which economics applied to this issue of human development really adds a lot of value. But I think the other thing that we brought to this field that's a little different is a sort of a healthy skepticism on how to measure these types of skills. And there's been a long history in trying to measure both cognitive skills through IQ tests and achievement tests, but also measure these non-cognitive skills. And one distinction that we make is that I think a lot of times measures of the skill are equated with the skill itself. That is, you think you have a measure for how persistent someone is, and it might be based on asking them questions about are you persistent. But people often view that as a true measure of the underlying skill. And what our approach differed a little bit is that we said that, well, actually, basically all of these measures are some form of behavior, whether it's taking a test, whether it's filling out one of these self-reported questionnaires. And we know that behavior can be influenced in multiple ways. And so in thinking about how to measure these skills, we said, well, actually, it's possible that whatever incentives they have to manifest these behaviors could also play a role in how they're measured, and it would be really important to account for that kind of incentive while you're measuring them. We have done some recent studies that demonstrate that's an important feature in trying to measure these kinds of both cognitive and non-cognitive skills. And I focus on the measurement issue just because right now, a lot of policymakers have picked up on this research showing that these interventions can be effective in developing both cognitive and non-cognitive skills, but they need some kind of reliable way to measure them. And I think we've hit on a few key areas in which they can be not reliable, and now we're trying to think about ways to make them more reliable. And one approach which people haven't, which I think is underused right now, is this idea that while any measure of a skill is actually a behavior, the sort of inverse is also true, which is that any behavior could actually be a measure of a skill as long as you account for those other things that affect that behavior that don't relate to the skill. So what kind of situation they're in or what incentives they might be having to elicit that behavior. And this opens up a whole new area of behaviors that you could consider as measurement. So for example, in some work I did in my graduate thesis, I argued that school absences are actually a pretty good measure of these non-cognitive skills. And the intuition is that, well, the kids who show up consistently day to day to school are exhibiting a higher level of motivation. And indeed, we show that this measure of absences is more predictive of who finishes high school than our test scores. And so through that lens, we can view it as a measure of a skill. But the key in that is that we attempt to account for any situations that could affect absences that don't correspond to a skill. So in that particular example, we account for how far away the student lives from school to sort of fix part of their situation and thereby compare students who live similarly far from school and therefore might have sort of different levels of effort required to get to school. So those are a few of the topics that I've been working on lately.